Good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful morning. I hope you're all well. I'm not in Poole Harbour, but I will be tomorrow. I'd like to introduce this morning Lord Turnberg from Manchester, who's going to speak to us about his amazing life. I think it should be very interesting. He started in Manchester and he was the Professor of Medicine and Dean of the Medical School, and then became President of the Royal College of Physicians. And in the year 2000, he was promoted to the Lords and has been there ever since, talking on the NHS, and I think latterly also on Israel. So I think it might be an interesting discussion, and at the end of his discussion, we will have questions. Over to you, Leslie.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. It's a privilege to have this opportunity to talk about myself. It's very nice of you to have me, and I hope you'll find it interesting. I'm going to start with my recent involvement in the House of Lords. Most people seem to be interested in how I managed to get in. How on earth did I manage it? And what it is I do there. Some people say, well, if you got in, can I get in? And I have to disappoint them, I'm afraid, that I have no control over who comes in. But I was as surprised as anyone when Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's chief of staff, rang me one evening at home about 9 o'clock and said, the Prime Minister would like to know if you will take the Labour whip in the House of Lords. Well, what on earth does that mean? I had no idea. My cousin Maureen said, are you going to take the whip or become a cross-dresser? And I had to tell her, well, if I get in, it'll be with the Labour whip. And so I decided to go and see the chief whip in the House of Lords to find out what it was about. He told me that, because I didn't want to be there all the time, I had other things I needed to do. And he said, no, you have to bring in to the Lords your expertise from outside. So keep whatever things you're doing, come in. But if you are on the Labour side, you have to vote with Labour when there's a division. And if you can't, you don't like what they're doing, you have to abstain. Well, I've done that most of the time, although I have voted against my party occasionally. But most of the time I behave myself in there. And it seems to have worked quite well. Then at the end of it, he said to me, you are a member of the Labour Party, aren't you? And I said, no, I'm not. And he looked a bit shocked. And I had to explain that the jobs I'd done before that required me not to have any political allegiance. But he said, well, you better join. So I joined. And I've been a member ever since, apart from a pause, which I'll tell you about later when I resigned. So in 2000, 20 years ago, I went in to this very strange building with the very strange people there. The building itself is full of corridors that you get lost in. I still get lost. And it's falling to bits, as you know. Bits keep falling off. The pipes leak. There's a fire risk. There's asbestos everywhere. So the whole thing is a disaster, almost as much as the people who work there. It's a bit like the last days of Rome when you're there. And it's not much wonder that the inhabitants sometimes behave badly. And that there is this rumor that they're going to shift us all to York, which I'm sure you've heard about. Well, the likelihood of that happening in my lifetime seems somewhat remote, which I'm very pleased about. I don't particularly want to go up to York. And there's going to be some sort of renovation in which we move out, and the Lords will probably go into the Queen Elizabeth II Hall. But it is a strange place for the people who are there. There are a large number of us, about 800, and the average age is quite old. I bring it up a bit myself, but it is quite old. And they are sometimes a bit sleepy. There is the story, which I'm sure you've heard, of the peer who dreamt he was giving a speech in the House of Lords and woke up to find that he was. That's a key to what it's like, but it isn't like that at all, because most of them are pretty smart people. Most of them are brought in because they have particular expertise, and we have people from everywhere. We have local councillors, we have people from the arts, we have people from science, we have presidents of the Royal Society, we have business people, we have lawyers, a lot of lawyers, and they are an interesting group. So if you stand up to give a speech, you have to be sure about what you're going to say, because there's bound to be experts in your field that know more than you. So it was with some trepidation that I got up and spoke, gave my maiden speech 2 weeks after I'd arrived. And interestingly enough, it was on public health and public health surveillance. That's become an increasingly popular topic nowadays with COVID-19, and I may refer to that a bit later. But I spoke about public health. Now, I know I was put in by Tony Blair to talk about health matters. I'd been in the NHS and in academe for a long time, and I'd helped the government, as I'll describe in a moment or two. Frank Dobson was the Secretary of State for Health. He helped me to come in, and I came in on the health ticket. So I did speak about the NHS, about medical research, medical ethics, and those sorts of topics. But increasingly, over the last few years, I've spoken about Israel and the Middle East, so that I talk about that rather more than I speak about health matters. I have to say, when I first went in 20 years ago, the House was somewhat antipathetic towards Israel and more pathetic towards the Palestinians. So it was a hard time, and not many of us, there were 2 or 3 of us who got up to defend Israel as best we could. So we decided, a couple of my friends and myself, decided that we needed to get organized, as Jews tend to do when they get involved in these sorts of things. So we arranged for a group of 4 or 5 of us from across the House, myself on the Labour bench, Stuart Pollock and Ruth Deach from the crossbench, and Munro Palmer from the Liberal Democrats. So we covered the whole 4 sides. And we then managed to engage a young man who helped us with briefings for peers around the House, so that we were always on the front foot, so we could respond to nasty questions, we could begin to raise issues ourselves, and to become relatively organized. I'm supposed to chair it, but chairing a group of Jewish peers is not an easy thing to do. As you can imagine, they've all got their own opinions. So I'm the convener. That's a much better word. I bring them together. And we're supported by a young man. We were supported by a young man called Noam Mervis, who you may remember is one of the sons of our chief rabbi, but more recently, he's gone off to get married in Israel. But we've now got another young man, a very bright young man, a PhD in conflict resolution, who's excellent. He briefs us on all sorts of things. So we can take action. And we then engaged with many of our supporters around the House. You may be surprised to hear that of the 800 or so peers, a large number, didn't used to be so many, but it is now, that of these 800, there are over 90 Jewish peers, which puts our percentage at about 12%, which is rather more than our percentage in the general population. So we do have a lot of friends if we can persuade them to get up and speak. So we circulate information to them all to make sure that they're briefed and can get up and respond to questions and raise matters. And that's meant that the usual suspects, myself, Stuart, Ruth, don't have to get up all the time and respond to these things. We've managed to do that quite well. John Mendelsohn, who's a Labour peer, managed to raise the money to support our young man. So we have a good system going. It's interesting that one of the people who tended, I'm sure you've heard of her, Jenny Tong, who always got up and had something nasty to say about Israel and the Middle East. And I'll tell you one instance where she got up and wouldn't sit down. She kept getting up and getting in. And the chief whip it was while the Conservatives were in office, kept saying, you've got to sit down, it's not your turn, and so on. And then a rather senior aristocratic peer got up and said, I beg to move that the noble lady be no longer heard. And the woman on the woolsack got up and said, the motion is that this lady should be no longer heard. The body is that say content. Everyone said content, and she had to leave the chamber. So she's been discredited quite markedly over the years, and everyone knows what she's going to say. So we've got a good win there. And the number of people who speak against Israel now has diminished. I'm not sure that they've changed their minds, but at least they keep quiet because we've got power in numbers. I should tell you a little about some of the things I've been involved in recently in the House of Lords. We've been concerned with three matters that have been of interest to us. The first has been a desire to get the British government to play a more active role in negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We thought that Britain is relatively trusted by the Palestinians and by the Israelis, and we could theoretically have a role in bringing it together, perhaps secretly, but certainly as a neutral, relatively neutral partner, where they might begin to think about talking about peace. Not an easy task, I have to say. But we've been pressing our own foreign secretary to take a role. And we have been involved with the Israeli ambassador, Mark Regev, before he left, and now Sharon Barley, his successor, temporary successor, with the Jordanian ambassador, who I've had conversations with, and the Palestinian envoy. They're all a bit anxious about this, as you can imagine. They're waiting, of course, for the American elections to see who's going to win there, because that will change the paradigm somewhat, we think, and they think. But that's something we're pressing quite hard on at the moment. And we will see if we can get some allies. We're trying to get the UAE ambassador to press the case as well. So we hope that that might happen. The Palestinians want the quartet to play a role. The quartet is useless. It comprises the UN, the EU, Russia, and America. Can you imagine them getting together? I mean, to do anything. It's a ridiculous idea. So we think Britain should play a key role. It would give a post-Brexit Britain a role on the international stage. So we think that that's quite a useful thing for them to be doing. We will see. The other thing we're interested in is ensuring that the sanctions on Iran continue, because they are proving effective. And in October, there's a time when they may come to an end. And that is an important time. The US has tried to press the UN, as you probably know, to continue the sanctions. The UN has turned it down. Any UN with Russia and China in it is bound to turn it down. But Britain abstained, which we thought was wrong. So we're trying to get them to take a greater interest as they come out of Brexit, to press the UN and to support the US initiative in continuing the sanctions after October. Iran, I don't need to tell you, is a rogue state that's causing all sorts of chaos. So we think that that's important. The third thing that we've become interested in at the moment, post-Brexit, is trying to get the science and technology, medical science and technology sectors in Israel to work with the opposite numbers in the UK. So we're going to try and press for a greater degree of interaction, which would give added value to both countries if we can do that. And I've got to speak in a debate on next week, actually, in September, beginning of September, when we go back, that I might bring it up if I can. So those are the sorts of things I've been engaged in. Now, the question is, I'm now something of a politician. This is something I've become a bit surprised at, because I was never a politician. I seem to, I don't know how that's happened, but it has. And nothing in my background suggested that was the case. And certainly nothing suggested that I might resign from the Labour Party. Until, of course, Jeremy Corbyn came along. And then it was a no-brainer. It's about 18 months ago I resigned from the Labour Party. And the reasons are pretty obvious. It was not the Labour Party I joined. Jeremy Corbyn thought that Venezuela and Cuba and Russia were models that we should import to the UK. Extremely left-wing, Trotskyite. And of course, he didn't do much to suppress any of the anti-Semitism that was going on through the party. And he had a very strong anti-Israel stance, which I thought was not exactly a good thing for me to belong to a party that had all those problems. So I resigned. I had a letter from Jeremy Corbyn saying, sorry to see you go. Not sure whether he was, but he sent me a letter. I also had a very nice letter from Tony Blair, who said he was sorry to see me go. He'd put me in, so he wrote a very nice letter, which I thought was very good, and I thanked him for that. So in a month ago, or maybe 2 months ago, I rejoined. Keir Starmer came along. He's been to our shul, I know, and spoken in our shul. He's been very good in lots of ways. He rang me up when I rejoined, and said thank you, which I thought was a real mensch. And I was really pleased that he did that. And he said that it was very good for him, because when he was trying to persuade the Jewish population to vote Labour and to come back, he can use that as an example. So I was very pleased to be able to be of use to him. I think he's a breath of fresh air. He's trying very hard. He's got an uphill struggle, but he's getting there. So that's the House of Lords. The question of how I got there is a mystery, but I can give you some clues. My background, as you know, is in medicine. And I had been in a variety of positions I'll tell you about, but Tony Blair put me in after I'd written a report on the health services in London for Frank Dobson. Frank Dobson was the new Secretary of State in 1997 when Labour came in under Tony Blair, and he asked me to review the health services in London, which I did with a group of 4 of us. And we went round and looked at all the hospitals and all the primary cares and all the health authorities. And we made a series of recommendations which were accepted by the government, one of which was saving Barts. You remember at the time there was a threat to close Barts and move it all to the Royal London. Well, we saved Barts. That was my claim to fame in those days. We didn't actually save it in the way it had been, but we saved it in some ways. We also arranged for UCH to be, we agreed UCH, University College Hospital, should be rebuilt. And of course, it's now been rebuilt a few years ago now. But you know, I used to work at UCH. I was a registrar there as a young doctor in the 1960s. And I had a little car, and I used to park it on what was called the Odeon site. It had been the Odeon on the corner of Tottenham Court Road that got bombed out. And so it was a bomb site. We could park our cars there. I was told, you're not going to be able to park your car there for much longer because that's where the new hospital is going to be built. And of course, it never was built until about 2012. So it was about 30 years before they eventually rebuilt it. I could have still parked my car there. And we merged health authorities, and we did a few other things that the government liked. Tony Blair liked it. So it was something that made the government think that maybe I should go into the Lords and talk about health, which is what I did. So why was I asked to do that review? Well, I'd been in medicine for a very long time, so I can tell you a little about my medical career. I never thought I was going to become a doctor. I was an only child. I was born into a poor family. My father was born in Romania. We lived in Salford in a terraced house with an outside toilet. And we were poor, but not abjectly so. I was an only child. I had a lot of uncles and aunts, all much younger than my parents. And I was surrounded by this group of adoring young teenagers. Now that's a nice beginning for anyone. You can understand why I became self-involved and self-reliant and selfish probably, because I was well cared for. I went to a grammar school. I didn't go to Manchester Grammar School because for little Leslie, having to go on 2 buses to Manchester Grammar School was just too much. So I went to Stand Grammar School, which was not a very good school. Howard Jacobson went to that school, but not long after I left, it closed down because it wasn't a very good school. But that happened to me a lot, actually, institutions closing down after I left them. And I was going to become a pharmacist because I thought pharmacy involved test tubes and Bunsen burners and chemistry, and science, which I liked. I didn't realize it involved toothpaste and cosmetics. But then a friend of mine said, I'm going to do medicine. I'm going to come. So I thought, well, if he can do it, maybe I can. No one in my family had been a doctor. No one in my family had been to university. So I thought, well, if he can go to medical school, maybe I can. I got in, he didn't, and I went through medical school very happily. No idea what being a doctor would be until I graduated. And I kept my head down. No one in the teaching professions or the consultants knew who I was. And it was no surprise that I didn't get any of the prime jobs. Yeah, I got a couple of prizes as a medical student, but no one took any notice of those. And I sent out to work in my first jobs at the small local district hospitals, the Northern Hospital, Jewish Hospital, Ancoats Hospital, all of which closed not long after I left. They were completely unviable hospitals. So you can see my beginnings were not exactly great. I had no idea what it was like to be a doctor, but I realized soon after I qualified that this was the life that was meant for me. It was one of the few professions where you have intellectual challenges every day. You have to work out diagnosis, try and understand the nature of a patient's illness, try to improve them, and if you made them better, they were grateful. So you have the two things. People are thankful for what you do, and yet it is intellectually challenging. So it was the best career for me, and I loved it. I was told in 1957 when I graduated that I would never get on in the main teaching hospitals because very few of the Jews ever did get on in hospitals. You have to go into general practice. So I was going to go into primary care, but I stayed in hospitals. And eventually I was taken on at the Manchester Royal Infirmary, the main teaching hospital. And I got through some exams by one means or another. And I carried on in hospitals. And by the time I had fully trained, Jews were getting much more involved in hospitals. And nowadays, of course, you can't get into UCH unless you are Jewish. It seems a very strange phenomenon, but it's been a complete change. But I did manage to stay on, and I carried on in hospitals. I came down to London, ventured out of the north to UCH, and I came to UCH for 2 or 3 years. Then I went back to Manchester, couldn't escape, came down to the Royal Free, and back to Manchester. I then went into research. I became interested in how things work and in gastroenterology. Gastroenterology was my favorite subject, largely because it was a large unknown subject. Lots of people knew about cardiology, neurology, and I thought gastroenterology was one where there was untrodden paths. So I liked that idea. So I went into gastroenterology. And then I went to America. Now, America was a big changing point for me for a number of reasons. One is I did research. I went to Dallas, Texas, a year or so after Kennedy was shot and taken there. An interesting place. And it was good in gastroenterology, and I did a lot of research. I had a year in which I did nothing else but research, a great privilege. But the main thing was we got married there. I'd met Edna about a month before I came to America. And we decided after a month that singleness was beyond me anymore. I had to get married. It was just, anyway, she wooed me. She wouldn't let me go, so I complied very readily. And she followed me to Dallas. And because she needed to work, she had to marry me. I had a certificate to work. And we got married in Dallas County Courthouse with Judge Tom Naylor, and got a big certificate with a Texan gold star on it. And it was quite a tricky business because Edna's English was in its early state of evolution. And this guy with a very strong Texan accent was hard for me to understand, never mind Edna. So she had to ask him to repeat what he said several times. But eventually we got through and we got married. And that was our first year of marriage. We did make it all kosher when we came back to Manchester. At the end of the year, we got married in Shul in Manchester. That was fine. So we did the deal. And that was 53 years ago now. So that was a wonderful way to spend our first year of marriage. My research went well. I came back to Manchester. I had several choices then. I could have gone into research, continued research, or gone into the NHS as a consultant in London, actually. But I chose to go into research. I wrote a book a few years ago called Forks in the Road. And it's a book about my life in the health service, the evolution of the health service and my life in it. And Forks in the Road came from Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra was an American baseball player who said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So I've taken several forks in the road, and this one was one I took to go into research. And it did me well because it got me a chair. I became a professor at a new teaching hospital that was opened by the Manchester Medical School out in Salford, Hope Hospital. And that was based on my research and on my clinical work. And it became a big gastroenterology research department in which I had over 30 young medical researchers working. It became one of the biggest GI research centres in the UK, and one of the reasons why I became president of the British Society of Gastroenterology a few years later. But then, after about 10, 15 years, they persuaded me to become the dean of the medical school. Well, that was the last thing I wanted to do. I was happy with what I was doing. I was in clinical work, which I enjoyed, research, teaching, all the things I enjoyed. Now I was going to be going into an administrative role. So, and I didn't like committee meetings. Committees were not my forte. But they persuaded me, I did it. And suddenly I found committees quite interesting. And the reason was I chaired them. And when you chair committees, you can start them on time, you can finish them on time, you've read the papers, you can make them move in the direction you want, usually. And if someone in your group, there were 100 professors, over 100 professors there, who are a unruly lot. They all want their own thing. So if someone of them got up and said something you disagreed with, you didn't say, oh, that's nonsense. You waited for someone else. You say, what do you think of that, Joe? What Bill has just said, and Joe says something, oh, I don't like that. And then you've got it okay. So I learned how to handle a committee, and I became quite interested in that sort of life. That was another fork in the road. And then I became involved on the national scene as a dean. You meet others. And then shortly after that, in 1991, I was elected by the Fellowship of the Royal College of Physicians to become the president of the Royal College of Physicians in London. Now that was a big change for me. We came to live in the college, the palatial college in Regent's Park. You've probably seen it. It's a Dennis Lasden building, a rather ugly building on the outside, quite a striking building. Dennis Lasden was the one that designed the National Theatre in concrete. He was allowed to build this one with little tiles on it, so it looked a bit better. And it's right in amongst the terraces, the Regency terraces in Regent's Park. But we lived in it on a flat on the top for 5 years. I was there 92 to 97. So that was a bit of a charmed life. It was one long meeting, meeting everyone, including government officials and so on, with one long dinner meeting. I had dinners twice a week at least, where I had to give a speech. So it was 5 years was a long time. It was hard, but it was better because unlike being dean, where you have to separate warring professors, in the college, everyone was facing more or less the same direction and was very supportive. So we did quite a few important things while I was there, which I can tell you about sometime. But 5 years was quite a long time. When I was finished, I resigned after 5 years and went and did a variety of other jobs, mostly in London. We had been going backwards and forwards to Manchester at the weekends, but we bought a flat in London because of the jobs I was doing, mostly many in the charity world. I was involved with Weitzman UK and Hadassah UK and a variety of others, and I was scientific advisor for the Association of Medical Research Charities, and some for the government. Excuse me. And then one for the government was quite interesting and relevant to what's going on now. I became chairman of what was known as the Public Health Laboratory Service. The Public Health Laboratory Service was I didn't know much about it, but it was an interesting organization which had a central laboratory in Colindale, where it did all the extremely sensitive tests for bacteria and other poisons in the community, and a series of many laboratories with personnel, public health men around the country who checked for outbreaks of infection, worked out where they came from, traced them, and stopped them. Now that may sound like a familiar role to someone brought up recently in the COVID-19 epidemic. Well, I had to resign. I resigned because the government of the day in 2004 decided we didn't need all these laboratories. What a mistake, what an error of judgment. And I resigned. Because now, if we would have had that, we would have been able to pick up cases of COVID-19 much quicker. We would have traced it and we would have done a much better job, but we didn't have them. So that was an interesting time. And then in 2000, the big surprise, the peerage, which I've described, and living the charmed existence, really, until I fear that it all fell to pieces. In 2007, we had the devastating news that our son, Daniel, was killed in an aeroplane crash in Africa. That devastated us, as you can imagine. That was 2007, just 13 years ago. And our lives were turned upside down. And it remains so. Everything I had achieved seemed as nothing. And we've not really known true peace since then. People look at Edna and me and say, oh, you've coped very well, but they really don't know how thin the ice is that we skate on, how near the tears are almost every day whenever I think of Daniel. Of course, losing any son is a tragedy, but Daniel was really very special. He was a doctor at the Royal Free. He had a PhD too. He was very bright, but he hid it with a great deal of modesty, charm, humor. He was loved by everyone, not just us. We loved him the most, but most others loved him. His patients adored him. He was a remarkable young man. He also had a PhD. We haven't recovered. I can quote for you from James Garville, who was the 20th president of the United States of America in 1880. He said, "There is nothing in all the earth that you and I can do for the dead. They are past our help and past our praise. We can add to them no glory. We can give them no immortality. They do not need us, but forever and forevermore, we need them." So how do you pick yourself up after that? Well, extreme difficulty and some time and distraction. Edna and I are doubly fortunate in having each other to lean on. I remember that Shlomo Levine came here when we were sitting Shiva and said, these sorts of tragedies either drive couples apart or bring them closer together. Well, it didn't do either of those. It certainly didn't drive us apart. And it couldn't bring us closer together because we've always been extremely close. As close as possible. And of course, we have our gorgeous daughter, Helen, our ray of sunshine, and our 4 glorious grandchildren who living where else but in Israel. So there is much to live for, even with the loss we always carry with us. And we've done, amongst our distractions, we've set up, as you probably know, the Daniel Turnberg Research Fellowship Program in his name, which brings together young medical researchers from Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian territories. And it brings them to the UK to work in a research institute of their choice, medical research generally. And they come for a few weeks and they meet experts in their field, learn new techniques, they meet people, and they develop collaborations that we aim to continue with them. And they do, many of them do. And over the years, the 10 or so years that we've run it, we have funded about 300 young fellows. And they're terrific. We've had 2 meetings in Cyprus, at which we bring the alumni together. And about 100, 90 to 100 came. And it was very heartening to see the Israelis and the Jordanians and the Palestinians mixing and being friendly, and it was terrific. And I was very touched and very tearful when one of our Jordanian fellows said to me, "We are all your sons now." That was something which was very touching. So the last distraction I have, which I've started in recent years, is delving into the history of Israel in the Middle East. Now, I've written one book, which was published in 2017, called Beyond the Balfour Declaration, the 100 years, the quest for 100 years peace. And it was brought out in the centenary of the Balfour Declaration in 2017. And I've just finished another book on the Mandate period between 1919 and 1939, which is with a publisher at the moment. I sent it to Tony Blair, incidentally, who sent me a very nice letter back. So I was very thrilled that he even read it, but he did. And now I'm on to a third book, which I don't know whether I'm going to be able to do it. I had thought I was going to write about Jewish Russian revolutionaries. You know that all the revolutionaries in Russia were in 1917 were Jewish, of course, bound to be. But then I realized too much of the literature was in Russian, and my Russian has not yet evolved far enough. So I gave that up, but I am writing a sort of historical novel, which I've just started, on a guy called Pinchas Ruttenberg, who is a remarkable man. You'll have to wait to read my book to find out about him. So that's what I've been doing recently, trying to distract myself. So let me thank you for your patience in listening to me all this time with my ups and downs of my life. And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Leslie. That was really illuminating, fascinating. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Good. Fascinating, very, very interesting story, and obviously sad as well. But I think you're leaving, you will be leaving something behind for eternity. So it will last, your fellowship, and it sounds very interesting. Thank you. It was very beautifully done. Do we have any questions? I personally would like to ask you about Jenny Tong. Is she still a thorn in your side?
Well, at the moment, of course, we're not going into the Lords, and it's we're doing everything on Zoom. So I have spoken a few times on Zoom, which is really not very helpful. You have to put your name down first and then talk. There hasn't been much on Israel and the Middle East, and as far as I'm aware, because I've not been listening too much, she hasn't spoken in the last few months. Before that, she spoke occasionally, but she's been a bit suppressed by the mountain of people who speak against her.
She has some people behind her as well. She has a
sort of... she did. There were a few people that spoke with her, but they've been less vocal recently. I think the situation in the Commons was much worse before the breakup than it was in the Lords. We turned it round rather in the Lords.
Well done.
I have a question.
Ellie, yes.
I echo the sentiment. Thank you very much for an extremely moving talk and hugely insightful. We've known each other for a long time, but I think I've just got to know you properly right now. So Zoom does work to some extent. Yeah. I can see that Laura and Katia with us. I wanted to ask you whether you connect with Lord Collins and Lord Winston as well in the House of Lords. And another stage to that question, how do you utilize Lord Sachs?
Yeah, well, I don't know when anyone utilizes him. He, as far as Winston and who was the other one? Winston and
Lawrence Collins.
Yeah, Lawrence Collins. Lawrence has been distracted by going off to Hong Kong and a variety of places around the world to arbitrate. So he doesn't come terribly often. I do see him. And he's very engaged with other matters, although he's very supportive, of course. Robert Winston is very supportive. We had lunch with him yesterday, so we see him regularly. And he does get up and speak quite a lot on Israel and on Judaism and on health, of course, health matters. So he's quite vocal. Rabbi Sachs comes when he thinks that he's got something to contribute. He doesn't come very often, but when he does, everyone listens to him very closely, and his speeches are masterful. They're terrific, and he is very well heard. He doesn't speak much on Israel, but he does speak on Jewish matters, on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. But he doesn't speak very often, but when he does, he's extremely effective. We circulate him, of course, with all our briefings.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. Would you like to speak a bit about the Labour and the Conservative Friends of Israel in the Lords, Leslie?
Well, yeah, there's Liberal Democrat Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel. They have representatives in the Lords, of course, and they are very effective. The Conservative Friends of Israel is much more well-funded, not surprisingly, I suppose, and has a much bigger following than Labour Friends of Israel. But Labour Friends of Israel is quite effective, and they have some very helpful people associated with them, mostly outside the Parliament, We engage with them, our own group, which is the British Israel Parliamentary Peers Group. That's what ours is called. We engage with them, and they provide a lot of the briefings, as does BICOM and Haaretz and wherever, and the embassy. And our young man who supports our group engages closely with them, as indeed do we. Is that what you wanted to hear?
I wanted to hear whatever you had to tell me.
Oh, well, there you are.
I didn't think that you would test their effectiveness in this forum, but I was curious whether you...
They are effective, yes.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Labour Friends of Israel had a hard time with Jeremy Corbyn, of course, as we all did.
Charles, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Leslie, for an outstanding talk. All the talks that we have heard over the months on this program have been excellent, but this one has excelled even the wonderful talks we had earlier. I wanted to ask you, Leslie, if you could tell us, if you were today the Secretary of State for Health, what would you be doing about COVID?
Well, about COVID, there's no doubt that we're way behind with all sorts of things. One of the things that is absolutely essential to put some money into, more money into testing, tracing, and eliminating as best we can. And the testing systems that we have in place, they seem to be, the restrictions that are placed on them make it very difficult. If you want to have a test, you have to fit into a certain category. You've got to be a vulnerable person or have got symptoms. That's the message that gets out. It doesn't suggest you can easily get a test. You can easily get a test, but that's not the message that gets out. There is certainly enough tests around for them to be done for everyone. They say they've got enough for 500,000 tests a day. I don't know whether that's the case, but certainly there should be. We haven't got the tracing system in place. We haven't got enough people paid and able to do the tracing. We've had the disaster of the app that didn't work. So we have to have a better system of testing and tracing. And that's where I would focus. And if we can do that, maybe we can sit upon the outbreaks that are occurring. It's fortunate that I think that although the numbers of cases are going up, the numbers of deaths are going down. And there may be several reasons for that. One is that it's a much younger population that's getting it now than got it initially, and the care homes are relatively protected now. So younger people are more resilient and less likely to die from it. And the other is we are doing more tests, so there's a bigger population being tested. But we're way behind. There's a lot to be done there. The government are right to put a lot of money into a vaccine, trying to get the manufacturers to produce a working vaccine, and we'll just have to see. But meanwhile, we should be doing better on the testing and tracing. That's the main thing for COVID-19. We should be bringing back the Public Health Laboratory Service that I used to chair many years ago. Sorry to be so negative.
Paul?
I was going to ask you that exact point. What was it in 2004 that you said got the Labour government to cancel these laboratories, and how much of a difference would that have made actually to fighting COVID?
I think it would have made a big difference because we would have had the mechanisms in place to do the tracing and tracking. We would have had the laboratory facilities up and running quite quickly. They were there, the infrastructure was there. And I think it's a tragedy that it went off beam. It was made worse in 2012 when the new health service reforms came in under Andrew Lansley and the Conservative government. It was the Labour government in 2004, was the Conservative government that killed it off almost entirely by taking public health out of the hands of the National Health Service and put it into local authorities. Now that alone would not have been a bad thing to do. But then from 2004 onwards, it continued to starve local authorities of funds, so that now local authorities are funded 40% less than they were in 2012. And one of the things that was cut was public health. They lost quite a lot of the staff, the public health staff, and the facilities that were necessary. So the end result that we were ill prepared, basically. Two reasons.
Thank you.
2004, 2012, and subsequently. There are lots of other things we should be doing for the health service, but that's another matter.
Thanks.
Okay.
Do we have any more questions for Leslie?
Hello, thank you for a wonderful, fascinating talk. I had a question on what you said as a young medical student and graduate, that you were told as a Jew that you had very little possibility then later on of going into consultant positions and would be relegated, as it were, to general practice. Do you think there was a difference in Scotland? I graduated from Edinburgh in 1958, so a very similar time. And I was so fortunate to be actually one of the two last residents of Sir Stanley Davidson, and was told that I would have further possibilities, and everybody knew I was Jewish. I wonder, do you think there was a difference between Scotland and England?
Well, I'm glad to hear of that difference in Scotland, I wasn't aware of what was going on in Scotland. I was hardly aware of what was going on outside Manchester. I was pretty narrow. But it was certainly the case in England. I know at the Manchester Royal Infirmary, there were no Jewish consultants. There was someone who had been Jewish, but was no longer Jewish there. And when I went down to UCH in the early 60s, there was Max Rosenheim was the professor, but there were no other Jews on the NHS consultant side. The academic side was better. But there were no Jewish consultants. Now, as I say, there are many more. So it did change. When I went to the Royal Free, that was later in 1966 or 67, I don't think there were any Jewish consultants on there either, in the Royal Free. But I remember Abe Goldberg was professor of medicine in Glasgow.
Yes.
When I was professor of medicine in Manchester, we used to meet. But I didn't know what was going on in the 50s in the North, but I'm very glad to hear what you say.
Thank you.
Can I ask, in the present day, why there are so few Jewish students in the medical schools? I mean, my daughter graduated from Manchester University, and there was hardly any Jewish colleagues of hers. Mainly they were Chinese or Indian or from South Asia, and a few Brits, but very few Jews seem to be going into the medical training, going to university. Is this worrying to you? And what's the...
Yeah, it's a shame because it's a great career. And as I said, I loved every minute of when I was a physician. And it's a great shame. Why are the Jewish boys and girls not going into it? Incidentally, at least half the medical students are girls or women. There's a large proportion of Indian, Pakistani, Chinese, Malaysian amongst them. But the Jewish boys and girls have tended to go into other things like the law. So I think they go into the law, they go into the media, they go into all sorts of other things which seem, I suppose, more attractive to them. The medical profession, a lot of people try and put people off going into medicine. It's a shame, really. I don't know why. I think it's a great profession, but there is a lot of negativity around being a doctor, and young doctors tend to, there's a lot of advice, don't do it, which is a great shame. I'm advising everyone to do it. No, I agree, it is a worry.
Tom?
Leslie, thank you again for a wonderful talk. It occurred to me that such an eminent person as yourself must surely be Hungarian. And you mentioned your father coming from Romania. Could you just be more exact, please?
It wasn't Hungary, it was Romania, yes. He came from Iași.
Okay, I don't know it. I don't know it.
It's near Budapest. But he was brought over to the UK by his parents in 1910 when he was only a year old, under a year old. So he was Romanian. My mother was born in England, but her mother was Polish and her father was Austrian. So they're all Middle European, but not Hungarian, no.
Just imagine what you would have achieved if you were Hungarian.
No, I know. Well, there are always something I can do. I'd love to be able to write a very nice historical novel, but I'm struggling with that.
Leslie, thank you so much for an illuminating speech this morning. We've really had a lovely, lovely time.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And I wish you all a wonderful Sunday.